Okay, sorry for the chaotic start, but thank you all for coming to our second building group power session. These sessions are being run by the Young Greens to help support our group organisers and Young Greens across the country to build your skills to get involved with the Young Greens and to develop and to make change in your local area. So tonight, I am going to be talking about a couple of things. So I'm Jane, I'm the co-chair of the Young Greens. I have also with me Callum and Amelia. If you want to introduce yourselves, one of you jump in and go first.
Yeah, I'm Callum. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm one of the Green Students Committee co-conveners.
Hi, I'm Amelia. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm also a Green Student Committee co-convener.
Fantastic. Tonight we are going to be talking about campaigning. So Callum is going to give us a little bit of an intro to Young Green campaigns, some stuff that we've done in the past, and also some campaign inspo from different campaigns that have happened. I'm going to talk a little bit about campaigning strategies and some theories of campaigning that people can use and get to know. And then Amelia is going to talk a little bit about using social media and comms for campaigning and making change. And then, as I said, at the end, we'll have a bit of time if you've got any questions for us about campaigning or about the Young Greens as well. So I'm going to hand over to Callum.
Lovely. So the first section, like Jane said, is going to be on Young Green campaigns, which is essentially an introduction to like what we're prioritizing this year, but by no means is like all encompassing. It's just so you can get like a little flavor of what the Young Greens are going to be doing. So we have kind of shortlisted 4 things that we really want to talk about today, and kind of like the focus for the exec committee this year. So that's educational reform, cost of living support, housing justice, and supporting striking workers. So all of these things very much fit into our kind of like climate and social justice. They're all very interlinked. So obviously like housing justice and educational reform contribute massively to like cost of living with like grants and rent controls, but also like supporting striking workers by backing industrial action by trade unions and encouraging young people to join a union. If there's anyone in the call who is working and isn't in a union, please join one, because we all deserve workers' rights and need to make sure they're protected. But there's a bunch of policies that we have that like we have councillors working on, our Young Green groups are working on, the exec is working on, and we're like pushing for things in the party as well that maybe aren't already kind of policy, but we're pushing in multiple ways, and like multiple groups are working on all of this stuff, so it's really exciting. Yeah, and like I said, it's just the tip of the iceberg of what Young Greens do. And then this section was just kind of like worth noting that those things aren't the only things that our Young Green groups and Young Greens care about. So on the next slide, there's a bunch of kind of inspiration and campaigns from across the country that I'm going to talk you through. So Greens consistently get involved in a variety of other campaigns and action. For example, recently Greens have been supporting a ceasefire in Palestine by doing multiple actions. So people have been to pro-ceasefire protests. The photo on the slide is from Bolton Green Party, who did a protest outside of Barclays, who has been financing the arms trade. So Greens across the country have been helping to organise and pressure and like push for a ceasefire and a peaceful solution. They've also, like Greens across the country, also campaigned successfully or helped to campaign to prevent ticket office closures for a variety of reasons, from like workers' rights to kind of accessibility, working with unions like the RMT and local groups that were pressuring the government to not close ticket offices, which luckily we succeeded in, which was really exciting. And more specifically for our student groups and maybe like Young Green groups as well, they've been really active and good at working with a wide range of groups to campaign for change. For example, there's Fossil Free Campus and Arms Off of Campus, which are both divestment movements headed by groups such as People and Planet. And the example we have on the slide is from the Sheffield Action Group, which Young Greens have kind of interacted with and had kind of a dialogue with and worked with to make sure that their reach is improved, and also to like have more of a coalition around these issues that relate to social and climate justice. There's also a photo from Lancaster where Young Greens appeared on picket lines to support striking lecturers, which I would encourage all of you to do if you kind of, appear on picket lines as a Young Green group. Maybe talk to the organisers to see whether they're comfortable with you bringing kind of political stuff or not, because some of them are a bit less enthusiastic about it than others, but it's still really important to go there and show solidarity. The photo was my bottom right, I have no idea if it's the same for everyone else, is a photo from action we took at Bath. Jacob Rees-Mogg came to speak. So there was a coalition of students. We had Amnesty, Left Union, Disability Access Group, Race and Equality, all came together to kind of protest and campaign against Jacob Rees-Mogg, which is really exciting. So essentially there are like loads of issues, and this is by no means comprehensive to campaign on. And so many groups are doing amazing things. We're going to go over some more like general kind of how to campaign strategies and like how to campaign rules. But if you want some specific advice on a campaign more locally that you really want to take part in, feel free to reach out to us. All of our contact details are on the Young Greens website. So if, for example, we touch on something that kind of doesn't really apply to your local situation, we can offer more advice on that as well.
Amazing, thank you, Callum. So yeah, as Callum said, obviously getting out and doing campaigning is really important, but how do we do it is a really big question, and is a question that lots of people have been thinking about and working on, and coming up with theories for how we do it over many different years. So I work in campaigning. For context, my day job is supporting student campaigners to help them build their power on campus where I work, and to support student leaders in their development as well. So I spend a lot of time talking about campaigning and campaigning strategies and how we build power and how we win together as well. So this is just kind of a selection of a couple of different campaigning strategies, some from more kind of broad-based organising, and some principles around how those types of movements do them. So a lot of this is built off of is what movements like the Sunrise Movement in the US is built off of, and then there's also a couple of bits that I pulled from the trade union movement as well that focus a little bit more on worker organising, but are still really kind of applicable to organising, particularly on university campuses, but kind of a little bit broader as well. And if anybody wants any more kind of resources or things to look at in terms of campaigning and organising strategies, let me know, and I can happily give you some recommendations. So there we go. So when we think about campaigning, we generally try and think about a couple of different types of campaigning and how we campaign. And I'm going to preface this by saying that none of these are bad. None of these are things that we want to avoid, but there are some that tend to work a little bit better and that tend to get us better results. So we almost view these on a little bit of a scale. So the first type of campaigning that most people are probably fairly familiar with actually is what we call lone wolf campaigning. And lone wolf campaigning is generally one or two individuals that are going out and are pushing for change in a particular area. Often it may be quite kind of policy focused, research heavy. It may be around a particular kind of policy change, around something that they want to see changed, and it tends to be very reliant on normally one individual, but maybe a couple, really pushing for that with the local leaders, maybe local council, maybe university leaders, to really kind of push for that change. And the biggest problem with this type of campaigning is that because it is only a couple of people that are doing this, it doesn't tend to get us a huge amount of wins. It doesn't tend to result in a huge amount of change. And it can be really slow as well. But it tends to be the type of campaigning that most people are familiar with, they may have done, and that we can quite often see. There we go, my slides are working. So the next type of campaigning that we think about is mobilising. So this is probably the one that if you've ever been involved in any sort of activism before, you've probably been slightly more familiar with this. So mobilising is basically around getting people involved in specific actions around a campaign. So usually they are more kind of public facing actions, and it may be a protest, or it may be signing a petition, or it may be sharing a tweet or something like that. And mobilizing is much more about having a small group of people that are the leaders and then bringing people along. It's what a lot of, for example, the big Extinction Rebellion protests that have happened recently, where they've been asking people to come down to London, that would be an example of a mobilizing action or a mobilizing campaign. They can be really, really powerful for bringing people together, for really broad-based coalitions of people to put pressure on decision makers. However, with these types of campaigns, we're not necessarily building a huge amount of leadership. And the thing that we find with campaigning is that where we are building leadership in people and building their ability to do things for themselves within a community, that's generally where we find that we get a lot of wins. And we call that organising. So people have probably heard the word organising before, hopefully, whether you like organising your drawers at work or if you've been involved in any sort of campaigning. And this is where we kind of tend to aim for a little bit. It tends to be a much more decentralized model. So there may be a couple of people who are taking more of a leadership role, but generally it's about the networks that we have and the connections that we create with each other. And most campaigns generally fit between mobilizing and organizing, and will often kind of switch between the two depending on what they're doing. The organizing model tends to focus much more on building leadership and building people's capacity to do things. And that's why we often find that campaigns that make real change, not just by getting decision makers to change their minds about things, tend to use more kind of organizing based models. So when we're thinking about campaigning itself, this is a particular campaigning cycle that is used by some certain organisations. So this one has come from Citizens UK, which is a community organising organisation here in the UK. And this is the model that they use to look at campaigning and how they structure campaigns. It is a cycle, and just because it's a cycle, it does not mean that you have to go round in steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order. Sometimes they may happen in a different order, but generally what we find is that step 5 tends to happen at the end, because if you've not done steps 1 through 4, you generally can't negotiate. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So just very quickly working around the cycle. So the first point that we tend to start with is organising. So this is about finding our leaders, the people that care about the issue that we're working on, and getting them in a room together and finding who those people are first. Once we found those people, we then want to know how big the issue is, how much of an impact it has. And if it's the right issue. Sometimes you may bring people together around an issue that isn't necessarily having that big of an impact on a community. But when you go out and listen to a community and understand what's going on for them, there may be something else bigger there. And those two steps really kind of work together and can almost form a little cycle in and of themselves. Because through listening to people, you can also find more leaders who may want to join an organising group. Then we want to look at planning. So this is looking at actually who are our targets? Who are we trying to get to change their mind? What are we asking for as well? Having really clear aims of what you're asking for is really key for step 5 when we get there. And having a really, really robust plan of what you're going to do when you're getting to taking action is key for being able to bring people along with you. And then we want to act. So sometimes we think about actions usually as going out on a protest or signing a petition. But there is a fantastic document. I always forget what it's called, but it's got 198 ways of non-violent direct action. That's what it's called. And it's a fantastic document, and it's got loads and loads of different ways to take action and to show the impact of an issue. One of my favorite examples was from Citizens UK. They were doing a campaign around getting women only swimming times at a local swimming pool, particularly for Muslim women who didn't feel comfortable or able to go and swim while there were male lifeguards there. And the swimming pool wasn't listening and didn't want to make any changes to it. So for their action, they decided that they were going to have a closed swim outside the swimming pool. So all of these local campaigners and organisers turned up with their clothes on and their swimming costumes on top of their clothes, bought a load of like, I forgot what they're called, rubber ducks is the only thing I can think of, like swimming equipment and stuff, and had a closed swim outside of the swimming pool and demonstrated the impact and the need for these sessions. And the swimming pool changed their mind and set up some sessions that had women only lifeguards, so that those women felt comfortable to go swimming, which was incredible. So there's lots of different ways that you do action. It doesn't always have to be a protest. It can be just making the decision makers aware of the impact of something. The key thing about action is that it's one of the things that encourages people to get involved. We say that action is something that drives organising, and therefore being able to act together is something that really empowers people. And the key thing about an action is that you're trying to get around the table to be able to negotiate with your decision makers, so that then you can negotiate on the aims that you have, and hopefully get a win. It doesn't always happen, and that's why we then go back around the cycle again. You may need to look for different leaders. You may need to consider a different plan. You may need to take more action. You may need to use these steps in a slightly different order. But that is very broadly the 5 steps to social change that we use. I've gone through that incredibly quickly. There are 3-day, 6-day training courses on this particular campaigning cycle that you can do. I've not gone into huge amounts of detail in that couple of minutes, but that is very broadly one of the campaigning cycles that we look at. So the next thing that I wanted to mention was power mapping, because if we know what change we want to have, what change we want to make, we need to know who can make that change. And we generally call them either the target or the decision maker. So we want to know who can say yes to our change. We want to know who can change the colour of the chairs in the library because we think that the green is horrible, and who can make the decision to change the colour of the chairs. We need to know the person who can say yes and who can make that answer. So we have a couple of different ways of looking at power mapping. So kind of the traditional way of power mapping is about one directional impact. So it's about the impact that you as an individual or a group can take to pressure that decision maker. It's very one directional, it's very transactional. It quite often doesn't always work, because particularly if we're thinking about a student campus, for example, a vice chancellor or the head of the library may just ignore students or may just ignore a group of students. And it also really limits the action that we can take. So, for example, we could protest outside the library or the vice chancellor's office, but we're fairly limited in what we can do. So the way that we try and look at power mapping is through relational power mapping. I sometimes call this the Kevin Bacon method, but I think I'm slightly too old for that reference to make sense to anybody except from potentially me. But basically what it is it's that everybody in Hollywood is 6 steps of connection away from Kevin Bacon. And this kind of follows the same theory of everybody in a community is connected to each other. And if you can work out those connections and how those connections work, then you can put pressure on your decision maker, on your target in many, many different ways, which is why it is about the relations that we have. So as you can see here in this diagram, there's loads more arrows than in our last one. And that's because rather than just looking at the impact that we as a group can make on our target, you instead look at all of the different relationships that you have and the different things that can put pressure on a decision maker. So for example, we're using a university here, just because tends to be a fairly enclosed community that we can map fairly easily. So a student group may have a lot of connections with the student union. They may have connections with elected officers, with staff there. And then the student union itself may have quite a lot of connection or relationship with the Vice-Chancellor, so can put pressure on them that way. The student union itself will probably also have people that sit on different university committees. And some of those committees will have more or less power over the Vice-Chancellor or different decision makers. So one that we use here is a university council. It tends to be the biggest decision-making body at a university. Is kind of the Vice-Chancellor's boss, and therefore they have a lot of power over what the VC does. So putting pressure and using university council to put pressure on a Vice-Chancellor can be quite a powerful thing to do. But if we look outside of more formal structures, I guess, you can also look at other things that may really, really influence a Vice-Chancellor. One of the big things that we know Vice-Chancellors care about in particular is their reputation, how they look in the press, which is why that tends to be something that a lot of people use when they're looking at campaigning on university campuses. And if that can have a really big impact on a Vice-Chancellor and the decisions that they make, that's why it has a really big arrow. And a student group may have lots of relations to their press. They may have a student newspaper that they know who the editors are. They may be able to write to the local press, and they may be able to use that to put pressure on the Vice-Chancellor. And by mapping out all of the different relationships and all of the different power structures that there is, it means that we can figure out different ways to take action and to put pressure on our Vice-Chancellor. So, for example, instead of just that protest outside the university library or the Vice-Chancellor's office, instead, there could be a motion to Student Union Council to get the officers to campaign on something. There could be a protest outside of University Council or lobbying of University Council members. There could be some social media campaigning to pressure the Vice-Chancellor on the reputation. And this therefore opens up loads more things that you can do to try and create pressure and create change. Okay, so I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this, but I'm hoping that you will, because I'm not sure that I shared my sound. So we'll see. Callum and Amelia, shout me if you can't hear it.
Let's cut to the chase. Are you saying that this government is purposefully scuppering any chance of a deal?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. They have torpedoed the negotiations and they have told the companies to take on the strikes because of what you heard in the Commons yesterday from Rishi Sunak, acting tough. He's given in to his backbenchers and all sorts of things about planning permissions and other issues. So he's going to try and make the RMT and the other trade unions as bogeymen and all the rest of it. And they want this strike action to go ahead when there are solutions and possible solutions that railway management, railway executives could put to us to try and get a resolution, and they are stopping that from happening. And if you had the chance to meet those railway executives in private, that's exactly what they would tell you. But they're not allowed to say it, of course, because they're contracted to carry out the government's wishes in terms of policy and industrial relations.
Let's cut to the chase. Are you?
Okay, so there's a reason why I show you that video, because Mick Lynch is one, just an absolutely incredible human. We love him for winning for the RMT and for taking on the government and being incredible. But he is also an excellent person at communicating some of the ways that trade unions campaign and some of the ways that they calculate why they want to take action. And that particular clip is a really good example of some of the ways that Mick Lynch is looking at what we call disruption costs and concession costs. And these are things that are primarily used in workplace organising, but are also relevant for kind of other places as well, which is why I wanted to touch on them really briefly, because they're really, really interesting. So think about concession costs first. So these are otherwise known as the power that we need to win. So obviously, in order to win, we need a certain level of power, whether that is power through the relationships that we build or power to effect change at an organisation. And the ways that we map this is through the cost of the settlement, so the cost of agreeing to do whatever it is that we're asking for. So in the case of the RMT, that is proper pay rises for the staff. And then the other thing that we look at is the ideological resistance. So these are either scored low or high, depending on whether they are low or high or not. And these can change as well. The key thing is that these can be changed by what we do, which is why we want to map them to know where we're falling within these particular structures. So with the example of the RMT, so that video was from, I think it was about a year ago now. And at that point, the RMT didn't really look like they were maybe going to win their dispute. They have now obviously just, I think today or yesterday, agreed to a deal, which is, it's taken them a year, but they've got there. And it's really exciting because at the time when that clip was taken, we were probably looking at quite a different situation than we are right now. So if we're looking at the concession costs at that time, there was quite a lot of ideological resistance. So the government was very, very against giving into a deal with the unions. There was really, really high ideological resistance, which already places us over here in this right-hand column. And there was also quite a high cost of the settlement as well. So obviously the government doesn't want to pay money. They don't want to give more money. We know that they claim that there is no money to give. And therefore the cost of the settlement is quite high. So we're probably up here in this left-hand corner, which looks like potentially there is no chance for the RMT to win. And that's potentially where we were at that point. However, through the excellent communication of people like Mick Lynch, and by levering our disruption costs, which I'm going to come to in a minute, they were able to change that. So they were able to change the ideological resistance to them winning into lower ideological resistance, which placed them where they can win. And that's something that they were strategically doing a lot throughout the last year. So that's concession cost, so that's the power required to win. But in order to have the power required to win, we need to generate that power, and that comes from our disruption costs. So this is basically how much disruption can we as workers or as individuals, as campaigners, make in order to generate that power so that we can win and get those concession costs. So we tend to evaluate this through the community that we have and through the organisation that we have within a particular organisation. And we look at this through organising and mobilising to know what level of power we have. So the really interesting thing with the RMT and with a lot of trade unions is that they tend to be more focused on the mobilising side. However, a lot of them recently have been switching more over to organising. So if we're looking at the role of workers in an organisation, generally, we want a highly organised workplace. We want lots of union members. We want lots of people who are engaged and involved. We want lots of internal relationships that people have so that then they're able to come together to go out on strike for a single day or for a number of days, because that generates a lot of power. That's what the RMT has. That's why we see them out on the picket lines all the time. That's why they're able to generate a lot of power in that particular regard. And then the second thing that we look at as well is the workers in the community, or the people in the community, and the connections that they have with the community. And generally, we see that with trade unions, there isn't always a lot of support from the outside community. It's not always there. Sometimes trade unions don't quite build those connections incredibly. And therefore that means that there can often be quite kind of a low mobilizing element. Doesn't mean that they can't win. It just means that there aren't necessarily those connections. But one of the things that the RMT and a lot of the trade unions have done really, really well over the last couple of years is actually building a really high profile of the unions within their communities. And that places them again in this top right-hand corner here, which means that they have a lot of power. They have community support behind them. They have local people turning up on their picket lines. And that means that they are more likely to be able to carry out strike action for an indefinite amount of time. Just very clear, I'm talking about strike action because these predominantly apply to workers and have been used a lot in workplace organising. Particularly, these particular diagrams have come from an incredible organiser called Jane McAlevey. So if you want to know more about them, go and read her book. She's great. But these do also apply to lots of other scenarios as well, when we look at campaigning, and they're really useful for analysing perhaps where we maybe need to change strategy, or maybe where we need to build more relationships with each other in our group, or maybe with the local community, or maybe we need to look at actually, do we have lots of ideological resistance, and how do we change that so that we can win? So that's a couple of campaigning theories. Again, there are lots and lots of them, but these are ones that I was thinking would hopefully be most useful for people. And I'm going to hand over to Amelia to talk about social media and campaigning. So over to you, Amelia.
Thank you, Jay. So starting with social media, it might sound simple, but when you're campaigning, your platform can be used for different reasons, and it can depend on what stage of campaigning you're at. So firstly, you might want to use your account to gain new members for your campaign, and it might look like gaining signatures for your petitions, or just getting people to attend to events. Social media to boost awareness of your group is also key for building your initial campaign team. So you can use your accounts for sharing general information about your campaigns and upcoming events, just to reach a wider audience. This is useful if you have a particular event that's coming up, or if you're attending another group's event and want to build those relationships as well, or just expand your reach as a group or organisation. And it also is good to show that you're active, just so that people are more inclined to get in touch and go along to events. Social media is useful for putting pressure on your target, because this and press statements and articles can affect your target's reputation, which increases the likelihood that you will get a response from them. You could put pressure on a target to encourage them to respond to your demands, or to set up a meeting so you can get to a solution. This approach generally can help move the campaign to the next stage if there's no initial cooperation, or if you want to gain traction. Next slide, please. As for which platforms you use, Canva is a good tool for making your resources, and platforms like TikTok can be good for short form video content and raising awareness in an easy to understand way. But there's also Twitter, or like more text-based platforms that could be useful. But generally, Instagram tends to be popular for sharing event details and campaigning in a visual way, because it is very versatile. When using your account, I cannot stress how important repetition is for campaigning successfully, because when you share your message repeatedly and from different perspectives, people are more likely to understand why the campaign is important and how they can get involved. You can use repetition effectively by ensuring you vary your content but keep the message the same, just to hone in on what you stand for. You could also use different angles by sharing your message for a third party. So for the Young Greens, we might support striking workers in the UCU, for example, and highlight the effects of poor workplace conditions on students. So providing relevant links between ongoing affairs and your campaigns can boost support. And it's good to stay updated and understand the links between what other issues are going on in society. As for branding, being consistent is a good practice, and it can ensure that you are recognizable online and in person. So, for example, if you're campaigning as a Young Greens group, you can use our branding, which is on the website under the resources section if you're interested. Moving on to communications, though, there are two main types. There is proactive and reactive. So proactive might include anticipating an event or change and pushing your campaign within that. So, for example, say you want to submit a proposal to your university's student council to help with your campaign. And because you know that proposal is going to be voted on, in the meantime, you would prepare a speech, talk to peers, raise awareness about the issue, so that people are likely to understand why it's important and how they can help the motion pass. Another example of proactive campaigning might be promoting action days or getting involved with your local party to build support for the local elections. As for reactive campaigning, you might have heard of the Conservatives' autumn statement that recently came out. The Green Party created a post to promote their values and what their response was. This is just one example of a good tactic to put pressure on your target and to show what alternatives you're suggesting within your organisation or group. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of examples from the Green Party. As you can see, I've mentioned the autumn statement, and that's just one reactive example. Another proactive example is the fossil fuel post, which was posted just before COP28, because the Green Party knew the context of this year's COP event, and they could link this to one of the Green Party's main policies. So this is a clever way to keep your campaign relevant and to see the bigger picture and gain support from people who might have not thought about making these linkages before. I think that's everything for me, so maybe we can move on to questions. Cool.